also, as
This
Carol,
meeting is being recorded.
as Carol alluded to, this is a very important sort of personal part of, a long time of my life. I spent a lot of time in Santa Barbara, both in college there and working there, and working for the planning department, working on these oil and gas issues that go on there. A lot of those related to climate nowadays. We didn't really realize it way back then, but the beginnings were there. And at any rate, it's just a tremendous honor to be here tonight and to convey to you what's going on with this sanctuary designation. So maybe the next slide would be good. What I sort of represent, as the regional director, a broad team that's working on this designation. And we don't have a staff that's managing the Chumash Heritage Sanctuary yet because it's not been designated. But my office is in Monterey. I have some staff from my regional office working on this, staff from Channel Islands National Marine Sanctuary, whose office and headquarters is on the UCSB campus, helping out, and other staff from other sanctuaries too, from Monterey Bay and Greater Farallones and Cordell Bank National Marine Sanctuary. So we have other sanctuaries on the West Coast. We've got a broad team that's working on this, and in the spirit of many hands makes the work lighter, a lot of folks are participating in this designation. So I'm here representing all of them and talking to you about this amazing area. This particular picture shows Morro Rock. You may all recognize that. What is impressive about this proposed area, for those that know it, is there are also equally dramatic massive dune systems in this proposed sanctuary along the shore. There's amazing, points like Point Arguello and Point Sal and Point Conception, and also an amazing seamount too. So while Morro Rock is the most visible, perhaps, of the features to many folks who come to this couple 100-mile stretch of coast, there are many more too that are part of what make this area special. If you go to the next slide, I want to talk just a little bit about where I work, who I work for. I mentioned my office is in Monterey, and that's where the headquarters is for the West Coast region for the Office of National Marine Sanctuaries on the right here. We are in the National Ocean Service within NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. The National Ocean Service is a sister agency to the National Weather Service. Most folks know NOAA best because they pay attention to weather reports, which come out of the National Weather Service. And our agency is in the Department of Commerce, in the broad federal government, and it's more than half of that agency's budget. And a lot of folks wonder why that is. Well, NOAA, years ago when it was first formed as an agency, charting the rocks, getting in and out of ports, conducting fisheries were important parts of the commerce of America. And so while this agency could have been placed in many different possible locations back in the 60s when it was created, it made the most sense to put it in the Department of Commerce, given the commerce that is dependent on the ocean. Next slide. So the vision for the National Marine Sanctuary Program is a thriving system of sanctuaries and other protected areas that inspire momentum for a healthy ocean. And our mission is to protect these treasured places in the ocean and the Great Lakes. We have several sanctuaries in the Great Lakes, and most of them, though, are out in the ocean of the United States. So if you go to the next slide, there's a map here that shows where all of these national marine sanctuaries are that make up the National Marine Sanctuary System. So there's 7 or 8 on the East Coast. There's 5 already on the West Coast. Olympic Coast is up off the outer coast of Washington. And then here in California, there are 4 already. Greater Farallones, which stretches from Point Arena to San Francisco. Cordell Bank, which is offshore of that and protects submerged island, if you will, a large bank that rises to 100 feet below the sea surface. Monterey Bay Sanctuary, which is the largest on the West Coast, and that stretches from Marin down to Cambria. And then Channel Islands. So those of you here from Santa Barbara, you have already a National Marine Sanctuary. Hopefully you all know that off your shore. In fact, they as well are having a public hearing tonight on a revised management plan for Channel Islands Sanctuary. And then there are several out in the Pacific Islands. And then these yellow squares on this map show sanctuaries that are in the designation process now. And that includes Chumash heritage. So this makes up the National Marine Sanctuary System. And while it's few in number, the total area that we protect is something like around 650,000 square miles, much bigger than the entire national park system. There are many more park units. Many of those are small. Most national marine sanctuaries are big, and this overall system is quite large in terms of area. And it's this ocean conservation focus, this Great Lakes conservation focus that is important to us. Go to the next slide if you could. So national marine sanctuaries aren't instantly familiar with everybody. It's maybe not something that you learn growing up or you've learned going to college necessarily. Our focus is principally on resource protection, but there are other mandates that are included in the National Marine Sanctuaries Act. We protect the maritime heritage of an area, and so that can include the submerged shipwrecks, aircraft wrecks, submerged historical features, as well as the maritime landscape of a coast, and indigenous communities heritage as well as part of what marine sanctuaries can protect. We are responsible for and expected to conduct science, research and monitoring. That can be social science as well as natural science on natural systems. We conduct education and outreach along the coast where the people live to explain what the resources are and explain important conservation messages. We tend to have volunteers that participate in many different ways when sanctuaries are created. Sometimes that includes doing citizen science work. We have volunteers that will go out in kayaks and provide interpretation, or walk along the coast, or go out here in the Santa Barbara Channel, there in the Santa Barbara Channel on whale watch boats in partnership with the Park Service, and provide interpretation to people on whale watch boats about resources that they see out on the water. We worry about habitat largely. Water quality is part of that. And that includes both shore-based pollution and trying to help identify ways in which communities and industries can reduce the impact they have on the ocean. But a huge amount of what we do on the ocean is centered around community partnerships. Unlike a park, unlike a national forest, we don't own the ocean, where federal government owns the land in those cases. And oceans are open systems. And there are many people that work on the ocean. There's many people that depend on the ocean for their livelihood. Commercial and recreational fishermen, divers, whale watch companies, aquaculture, scientists. It's a livelihood to be conducting marine science in an area. And so through that, we promote responsible recreation and tourism as well in the marine sanctuaries. And all these are sort of the diverse activities, the diverse expectations that come with the sanctuary. The last thing I just want to say on this, for those that are still trying to get a mental image, think of sanctuaries more as a national forest than a national park, but we have attributes that are more like a national park too. So for instance, a national forest will have many of these same elements in terms of bringing people to the forest for recreation. But the forests can conduct timber harvest and mining operations and cattle grazing. We don't ourselves conduct those activities, but we help to encourage them to the extent they can be sustainable and not lead to adverse impacts to those resources. So if you go to the next slide. I mentioned at the beginning of the last slide, principal focus of what we do is centered around resource protection. That's why the sanctuaries are designated. And by that, we're looking to maintain the balance between resource conservation and sustainable uses. There's a lot of different ways that can happen. We try to be as innovative as we can to work with communities, with the users that are involved in those activities in the ocean. And we've certainly found over the years that really just about everybody wants to do the right thing. No one's by design, rarely if ever, trying to do harm out in the ocean. And so by using non-regulatory solutions, we can create better outcomes, more durable outcomes, that there's buy-in for those solutions rather than sort of a top-down approach. There are regulations for marine sanctuaries. Those might be a dozen or so things. They're pretty broad in nature. Typically, just using Monterey Bay or Channel Islands, no oil and gas development is a common regulation in sanctuaries, but also no disturbing the seabed, or no discharges, or no take of historical resources. There could be exceptions for those in the regulations, like, well, you can't disturb the seabed. We don't prohibit anchoring a boat unless there's really sensitive resources there. And then we may have a zone where we don't want anchors going in, or we may provide anchor buoys, mooring buoys, so that we can prevent damage to the seafloor. We issue permits where necessary, where it can be allowed, where we can meet certain findings that would allow activities that are otherwise prohibited. And recognize some national marine sanctuaries are in very remote areas where there's little to no human activity, while others, like where I am now in Monterey, are right offshore of an urban area. And because of that, there are times when we do have to issue permits for activities that might otherwise be prohibited, but are simply necessary to ensure important activities can take place, provided they're designed in a way to minimize harm. And then lastly, our enforcement program does exist for laws, regulations, and permits, but we concentrate on education and outreach first to really try to help focus people's attention on what's the best thing they can do to protect that system. Next slide. So let's talk about Chumash Heritage National Marine Sanctuary. So this area of coast that's now proposed, much of it has been around as a proposed national marine sanctuary since the early 80s. Once again, was kind of constituted, reinvigorated in the mid-90s through both an expert panel of scientists looking at areas around the country, identified the area off Morro Bay. The County of San Luis Obispo, the state of California, both reproposed that, asked it to be expanded in the mid-90s as a Morro Bay National Marine Sanctuary. It was never designated. Monterey Bay to the north was, Channel Islands to the south, but not Morro Bay. But NOAA reconstituted its sanctuary nomination process and asked for nominations from community groups so that we knew we had buy-in from the beginning. And the Northern Chumash Tribal Council submitted a proposal on behalf of a very large community group, a big constituency, and they proposed it as Chumash Heritage National Marine Sanctuary, covering even a slightly larger area, including parts of the Gaviota Coast. We put that in the inventory of sites. It met the criteria that we use to evaluate proposals. And in October 2015, went into the inventory as a site we could designate. Those sites are in for 5 years. We reviewed that at around the 4.5-year point last year, 2 years, a year and a half ago, and concluded that it still met the criteria. In fact, there was an amazing level of outreach and support for that. 14,000 public comments in total. 96% of those were in favor of keeping it in the inventory. We did keep it in the inventory, and then in November of this year, we received direction to initiate that process to designate this area as a new national marine sanctuary. So let's talk about what that process looks like. Next slide. Well, first, let me just make sure everyone's at least got a mental picture of where this sanctuary is. If you look up in the north, it begins in Cambria, where Monterey Bay Sanctuary comes in. And this is the boundary proposed by this broad community constituency led by the Northern Chumash Tribal Council. And this boundary would go along the mean high tide line as they've proposed it, down the San Luis Obispo County coast. It would exclude the harbor in Morro Bay and come down into Santa Barbara County to Gaviota Creek. This is their proposal, and then come to the southwest, touching that western corner of the Santa Barbara, in the Santa Barbara Channel for Channel Island Sanctuary, around Rodriguez Seamount, and then back all the way to the north and then back into the coast. I want to draw your attention to this blue area that's been proposed for wind energy development. It's at the same time undergoing environmental review. by BOEM, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. And that's an area that the administration, the Biden-Harris administration, would like to see that area get full evaluation for wind development. At the same time, they want to see Chumash Heritage get full evaluation as a national marine sanctuary. So our intent now is to not have overlapping boundaries. And so that's why it's shown as being perhaps a cutout. We'll see what that final boundary looks like for the wind energy area, as well as the final boundary for the sanctuary. But that's an area we would try to decouple the sanctuary and not have it overlap with the wind energy area. Then there's many, many uses in this area. This slide could be very cluttered, the map with many, many uses. I'll touch on those in just a minute, but keep this as your image for the area proposed that we are beginning the review process for to possibly make it a marine sanctuary. Next slide. So I mentioned it covers both counties. That stretch of coast is around 156 miles. The total area is around 7,000 square miles. And I mentioned what are proposed as the northern and southern boundaries for that along the shoreline. An important part of the proposal, and it's not the only focus, but it's one of the principal focuses of this proposal, is to recognize the indigenous culture and history in this area of both the Chumash, and they are the ones who have proposed it, but also the Salinan have been historically have used parts of this coast. They identify with it way north of Morro Bay. And so this proposal nonetheless recognizes that there's been indigenous communities, indigenous use, human occupation along the stretch of coast going back at least 13,000 years. And that's a very important aspect of the proposal. There's other aspects too. If you go to the next slide, this area is nationally significant in the eyes of the proponents. I will say in our eyes too, and that was one of the criteria we thought it met, that we used to evaluate the sanctuary. Massive kelp forests. I mentioned some just unbelievable dramatic sandy beaches that are frankly underappreciated in my mind in these dunes, as well as wetlands along the area. It's a very important natural feature for whales, a number of different species, many of them threatened or endangered. A couple different species of sea turtles rely on this area. Countless shorebirds, some of which are endangered, like the snowy plover. Sea otters, as I think you may all know, are slowly increasing their population size. And then there's one, maybe two abalone species that are on the endangered species list that depend on this area. There's some amazing geomorphological features like the Santa Lucia Bank, Arguello Canyon. I pointed out Rodriguez Seamount as well. That's part of the proposal. And it's an area that has a strong sense of place for coastal communities. It's a very much more urbanized coastline in San Luis Obispo than this part of Santa Barbara, very rural, but there are state beaches in this area. There are county parks and county beaches in this area. And it's an important area to the indigenous communities, to the Chumash people, especially relative to Point Conception and you know, centuries, millennia of harvest along the coast. We're also aware of hundreds of shipwrecks. We're working to, you know, refine that, but hundreds of shipwrecks, several of those that are on the national list for historic places, the National Registry, and that is frankly one of the more underappreciated parts of this coast. The history of this coast has been dotted with shipwrecks, and nonetheless, a sanctuary would help tell that story. Next slide. So a central part of the proposal I mentioned is indigenous communities. It's these also this natural ecological system here, but also the proponents recognize that national marine sanctuaries offer the best, maybe in some ways the only way to create comprehensive spatial planning in the marine environment to deal with numerous threats. And there have been numerous threats, many active presently. Oil and gas is still being produced in this area. Under the past administration, there was a developing concept to release areas there for new oil and gas development. There's existing platforms that are slated for abandonment, pipelines as well, seismic survey testing, was a very contentious issue in San Luis Obispo County 4 or 5 years ago, out of concern that there may be faults that could affect Diablo Canyon. Diablo Canyon itself is slated for decommissioning. How is the offshore environment used for that decommissioning process? Those are questions that are out there. But it's been proposed for offshore wind, some conceptual work for offshore wave energy development. And if you look at just stopping right there on that list, everything on the top half of that is all about offshore energy development. And I was talking to someone recently just about the maybe disproportionate amount of offshore energy, coastal energy that's come out of the northern Santa Barbara, San Luis Obispo County coastline for 100 years now. And I haven't done the math myself, but I think it's probably safe to say more energy is produced in this stretch of coast than is consumed in this stretch of coast for sure. Fiber optic cables, it's a major landing site for fiber optic cables. Climate change is an ongoing threat. As you all know, that's what you focus on. But there's many tiers as it relates to the ocean acidification, warming of the seas, rising of the seas. Those are kind of the three pillars of doom, if you will, for the ocean systems that climate change offers. And within that are certainly different effects on plants and animals that depend on these systems. And there's even been a proposal, it's not gone forever. I understand that folks were looking at maybe discharging wastewater from the Central Valley into that area precisely because there was no marine sanctuary there. So with that said, these folks that came forward with this nomination have seen, as they told us, the success of addressing comprehensively through ecosystem-based, community-based processes, how marine sanctuaries deal with those issues elsewhere. And so they've brought this nomination forward to create that process, that mechanism to address these issues. If you go to the next slide. I mentioned the focus on indigenous communities, and I won't, repeat all of this, but the Northern Chumash Tribal Council and the San Ynez Band, for instance, the Coastal Band, and really all the bands that we've heard from so far, the Chumash Nation, are in support of this designation. There's another group, the Salinan, that we're working on talking to. They may have some different ideas, but we're open to hearing their thoughts too about this area, because it's been a tribally nominated area. That's, as I said, been a central focus. And while we have tribal communities in other marine sanctuaries, and we work very closely on managing resources, this may be yet the next step up from there. How do you manage a marine place that the federal government designates, that includes state waters, that involves shorelines that are important to cities and harbors and counties, that are also long-term areas of importance to an indigenous community? So we're working on what that would look like. Is it through educational programming where we would highlight indigenous culture? Is it research about paleo shorelines, right? Where was the shoreline when there was a strong ice age, and are there villages in those areas? The native communities think, yes, there are, and we need to understand them, but protect them too. And so there's many other collaborative approaches that are being discussed. We're at a very early phase in that process. Next slide. So this phase we're in now, as you can see on the slide, we're only got the first one ticked off here. That's the public scoping process. And on Monday, on January 31st, the public comment period closes. And we've received, I don't know, 600 comments or so far, and I'll explain in a little bit how you submit those comments. But this scoping phase allows us to really get a sense of what the community thinks are issues and approaches that we should be using to address threats, if you will, opportunities, if you will, in the marine sanctuary. Do some things need regulation, or maybe we don't need a regulation? We simply need an action plan, an education program. What should other things be like for the boundaries, et cetera? And I'll touch on that in a minute. But it's a blank slate. We've got a proposal. We've put that forward for people to review, but we've got nothing yet on that slate. And so that's what we're waiting to hear in our hearing. But next we will digest all of those comments that we hear from people. We use those to draft the management plan, a proposed rule that's got the regulatory elements, and a draft environmental impact statement. And we'll also be doing intergovernmental and stakeholder consultations during that process. Roughly a year from now, maybe our hope is maybe a year from when we started. So in November, these documents go out for public review. And you and others get to tell us, did we hit the target? Did we miss the target? How do we make it better? Where do we go too far, et cetera? And so that public comment phase is very important for us to get feedback on what people think about the proposal. We review those comments, we make adjustments to the plan, we adjust the environmental review, and put all this out in theory as a final package if we're going to designate it, or also in theory, NOAA may choose not to designate it. That's the process. It takes 2.5 years. That's going really fast, but not too fast. We've done some in that time frame before. Some have taken longer, and that's why I mentioned we're trying to really staff up by using a little bit of a lot of people's time within NOAA to help us put this plan together, to listen to these public comments, to draft action plans in the management plan, and write an environmental document. So if you go to the next slide, I think we're getting close to the end here. There's a couple ways you can submit comments. Something's missing down at the bottom, but if you want to Google it up, I think maybe the color just got off. You can just Google Chumash-Heritage Sanctuary, and you should get a NOAA website that we have set up, and you can get more information and you can keep track of what's going on. But you can submit comments electronically through a portal called regulations.gov. And the docket number is here, NOAA.NOS, NOAA-NOS-2021-0080. And then you click on the comment now. So that's one way you can submit comments. Next slide, there's another way to do it. You can go the old-fashioned way. You can mail it to us, and we'll scan it and upload it. And here's the address for someone on my staff, Paul Michel, who will receive those comments and send those. As you send them to him, we'll get those. Just get them postmarked by the 31st, and then they'll be part of the record. We have had 3 public scoping meetings, virtual like this, where people can make comments virtually. We received maybe 50, well, maybe 100 different people spoke at those in total. But those have now passed. So here are the ways in which, the next couple of days, if you haven't already, you can give us comments and feedback. Next slide, and then I think that is the last one I have. I just want to flag the kind of things that we're looking for. So are these the right boundaries? It's a pretty big area. Is it too big? Should it be bigger? If it's smaller, in what way should it be smaller? What is the location, the nature, and the value of resources that we should be protecting? What are the threats to those resources, and how do we best protect those threats, those resources from those threats? How do we highlight the indigenous history and the culture of indigenous communities here on the coast? Is there research and monitoring that you think we should be doing and incorporating into a research and monitoring plan? Not that we'll get it done before we designate it, but what we will then work on over the next 5 to 10 years, let's say, that this new management plan will be in effect. How about historic properties that we should be considering? We talk often about protecting and promoting the blue economy. What are the elements of the blue economy, and what are ones that should be emphasized, and what are some maybe that we should de-emphasize? We always ask, do we have the right name that's been proposed here? So we're asking that here, is it the right name? Where do we do things like put an office, or do we have a visitor center, or we have a boat? Where should that boat be? What kind of boat do you think we need? We'll take that and any other relevant information and input you have about how we might designate and manage this area. So this is the kind of feedback we're looking for. This is what the sanctuary in this sort of whirlwind tour could do. And I think I'm done there, and I will be happy to take questions that you have for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Director Douros, for that incredibly enlightening presentation. I would like to pause and stop the recording here And